Hello, and thank you for joining us for the Strawberry Educational Conference at the 2021 Virtual Southeast Regional Fruit and Vegetable Conference. My name is Jeff Cook. I'm a University of Georgia Cooperative Extension Agent in Taylor and Peach Counties and Area's Peach Agent. I'll be your moderator for today. Pesticide CEU credits are available for most of the presentations during the live Southeast Regional Fruit and Vegetable Conference. Check the Pesticide CEU guide for a list of the approved presentations and the participating states and number of credits. Note, these credits are only available to registered attendees and they're only available during the live event. They're not going to be available for on-demand viewing. The pesticide CEU process is a three-step process. The first step you must do whenever you log into a presentation is sign in via the audience chat box. Sign in by putting your first name, your last name, and the state for which you're requesting credits. Once again, go to the audience chat box, which is on the left-hand side of your screen. Type your first name, your last name, and the state for which you're requesting credits. Then once the presentation is nearing an end, you need to sign out. You do this the same way. Go to the audience chat box on the left-hand side of your screen, type your first name, your last name, and the state for which you're requesting credits. Once you've done this, you're done for that presentation, but you must do that at each presentation you attend to receive credits. To complete the process, you must go to the Pesticide CEU registration. You only have to do this one time for the entire conference. To access the Pesticide CEU registration web link, open the Pesticide CEU guide on the Event Resources tab located under the media player. The Pesticide CEU registration web link is located on the front cover of the guide. Remember, you don't have to do that for every presentation, but you must do that to receive credits for the presentations you attend. These presentations are pre-recorded to reduce technical difficulties, but we will be taking live questions and answers at the end of the talk. To get your answers to the speakers, type your question in the question box and press send. Make sure that you press send so that your question is sent to the speaker and the moderator. Don't forget to thank our 2021 Southeast Regional Conference sponsors and exhibitors by visiting the virtual trade show and the featured products pavilion. Lastly, don't forget our daily networking opportunities. Join us each morning for coffee chats beginning at 8:15 and the evening for receptions and networking beginning at 5. I'd like to introduce Dr. Stanley Culpepper, with the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension, who will be talking about bed formation for plasticulture operations. Dr. Culpepper is a professor and extension agronomist at the University of Georgia. He began his career in 1999 with weed science responsibilities in cotton, vegetables, and small grains, and continues that with those responsibilities today. Stanley has been an invited speaker in 24 states and several countries. He has co-authored and authored many refereed journal articles, book chapters, abstracts for presentations, professional meetings, hundreds of extension publications, and newsletters and blogs. Some of his best work has been authoring or co-authoring several successful Section 18 packages, critical use nomination packages, and Section 24C state herbicide labels, bringing new weed science products or management tools to Georgia growers. Stanley has also been invited to serve as a member of the Agricultural Science Committee of the U.S. EPA's Science Advisory Board. Bed formation is so critical in any kind of plasticulture operation, especially strawberries. Proper bed formation allows for better movement of water, nutrients, better root growth, and better movement of your fumigants when you put them in the soil. I've seen Stanley do this talk several times, and I've seen strawberry beds across the Southeast and across Georgia, and I know we need to do a better job. So without any more introduction, Dr. Stanley Culpepper.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's an honor to be here with you today as we focus on forming that perfect mulch bed. So as we go through the presentation today, what I really want you to think about how that bed and how we form it influences the activity of the fumigant, the movement of the water, as well as the movement of the fertilizer. All right, let's get started. When we have a discussion about large bed plasticulture, it's always good to remember how great the days were with methyl bromide. What an amazing tool for us to use in vegetable production. Of course, in 1990, with the signing of the Montreal Protocol and Clean Air Act, it ultimately led to the loss of methyl bromide. We had developed 5 alternatives to methyl bromide that were quite effective depending on your production practices, until about a year or a year and a half ago when we also lost the use of paladin. When we lost Paladin, we were really down to three alternatives. We have Telone 2, chlorpicrin, and Metam, either under TIF or LDPE mulch. And then we really have Pitchlor 60 under TIF mulch, which I'll expand on as we go through the presentation. For our current fumigant systems to be effective, we really have to help them out. To begin, we got to understand what pests we want to control and where those pests are in the soil profile. Next, we got to choose the right fumigant system, placing the fumigants where the pests are at, and helping that fumigant remain at a high enough concentration over a long enough period of time to control it. The photo on your left shows what we would call a good bed that helps mitigate the movement of that fumigant out of the soil profile. Where the picture on the right shows you a bed that is not helping the fumigant at all remain in the soil profile to control the pests we're trying to manage. There are many components to forming the perfect bed, but soil moisture is certainly among the most important. There are also many ways that you can determine the appropriate soil moisture. The easiest and the simplest is looking at the shoulder of the bed after you lay it. If that shoulder is falling off into the sides, that's telling you directly we're not going to keep the fumigant system in the soil profile, and it's also going to challenge both water and fertilizer movement across the bed over time. In addition to understanding the influence of moisture on that perfect bed, if we have the ability to remove the trash and as many clods as possible, this would improve not only bed formation, but also improve the movement of the fumigant through the soil profile. For those who are blessed enough to have flat, smooth fields, this would also be beneficial to laying a very firm and consistent bed. I often get asked, how do I know when I've achieved the perfect bed? Mr. Paul Sumner, our ag engineer, worked to address this question for many years. And after conducting a lot of research, he came up with a very simple answer. In general, a 150-pound person needs to sink 1/2 to 1 inch to be forming the perfect bed to facilitate fumigant movement throughout the soil profile, as well as water and fertilizer movement once we start drip irrigating. So if you formed a bed, you step on top of it, and you're 150 pounds, and you're sinking 3 to 4 inches, we need to consider trying to improve the firmness of that bed. What are some opportunities to do that? Number one, consider double pressing. Here's an example of the first operation followed by the second operation. Both have pans. A second opportunity, you can take pan 1, make it a 34 by say 10 inch pan, and then you can follow with a second pan, say 32 inch by 8 inch pan, and compress that bed and make it more firm. Of course, they're just examples. You would have to develop the bed shape and size that you want. If double pressing or manipulating the size of the pan doesn't achieve your goal, there is one approach we actually use to conduct our research. Keep in mind, I don't have a 3-row rig. The pictures I'm showing you are from grower studies and grower cooperation. I've got a small 1-row unit, not very heavy. Sometimes I have to throw a mound up, depending on the soil texture, to form that ideal bed. So this is also an option for you if you're struggling to form the bed. This will help a lot fill the middle of the pan. Now I do want to point out, I didn't think a grower could make a bed too firm. But we actually had a grower make a bed that I stepped on and I didn't sink at all. So don't take it too far. Again, that ideal bed is one that a 150-pound person will sink 1/2 to 1 inch after you've concluded the bed formation. Let's take a minute and actually walk through how we're applying the fumigants in the various systems. With the UGA 3-way, we have the Telone, then we follow with the chlorpicrin, and then we follow with the Metam. Of course, the Telone is for nematodes. We generally like to apply that quite deep. Here's an example of us using a Yetta rig applying the Telone 12 to 14 inches deep. Make sure you don't apply Telone when the soil is too wet. it is very, very difficult to get telone out of wet soil. So that is an absolute no-no that can come back and be quite problematic. Immediately following the telone, we come in with the chlorpicrin application. This is our first bedding operation, and you can see in this example I have a pre-bedder with a pan 10 inches tall and 34 inches wide. I'm basically injecting chlorpicrin with 3 knives evenly spaced across the bed, about 8 inches below the surface of the soil. Next, I'm going to follow up and lay the plastic. On the plastic rig, we also have a bed. Now my bed is 8 inches by 32 inches, again compressing the bed to get the right firmness that I like to maximize fumigant activity, water movement, fertilizer movement. And at the same time in this example that we're laying the plastic, just ahead of that we're applying Metam. And on the far right hand side of your screen I've got an example of a grower operation where they have added shanks to apply their Metam. And in the bottom, that's an example of my rig where I just added sweepback knives. The key to the Metam is you have to place it 4 inches deep and 4 inches apart. Alright, you cannot go wider than that because it does not move across that soil very effectively. You have to put it at the right place for success. I often get asked, instead of shank injecting my Metam, can I drip inject it? So I want to take a second to show you the difference in the effectiveness of those two application methods with Metam. Now keep in mind, we're using Metam primarily to control our weed species. On your left is a picture of Metam drip injected. I don't know how successful you are, but when I apply Metam through the drip, I can move it 8 inches on each side of that drip, and that is it. And what you have there is a perfect example of a disaster, because 3 weeks after that injection, that nutsedge will absolutely take over that entire bed. On your right is that shank injected treatment where we actually place the fumigant exactly where we need it to go, 4 inches down, 4 inches apart. Now one thing I want to point out with the picture on the right is really interesting. First of all, if you look up front, you can tell right where I cut the fumigant on, right? Second thing I want to point out, I have a few nutsedge escapes right on the shoulder. If you have the opportunity, increase your orifice size on the very outside of those shoulders to improve weed control. Maybe 5 to 10%. Of course, do not exceed the label application rate. The next thing we have to consider is what type of plastic are we going to lay? Are we going to lay LDPE or are we going to lay TIF? When you're making that decision, the first thing that comes to my mind is, do you have a nutsedge problem? Here's an example of the UGA three-way as influenced by TIF or LDPE mulch. In the center of your screen you can see a check. Yes, that takes a lot of work to achieve that level of pretty nutsedge. On your left you can see a fairly effective system with LDPE mulch, but on your right clearly the TIF mulch is more effective. Now why does this result occur? It has the same principle as what we've been talking about. That plastic more effectively mitigates the loss of that fumigant out of the soil profile. So we have a higher concentration for a longer period of time, which ultimately results in better pest management. We've systematically walked through the UGA three-way system. What about Picklor 60? Does it have a fit? And I think the answer is yes in some production scenarios. What I would consider in my mind, number one, how many crops am I going to grow on an installation of plastic? If I'm just going to grow 1 or 2 crops and then I'm going to pull the plastic up, that gives me a little more flexibility. Number 2, do I have a bad nutsedge problem? Number 3, do I have a bad general weed problem? Because again, Metam sodium is an extremely important component of a system to control weeds. Also, I'll point out, if you apply Picklor 60 like we do, injecting it 8 to 10 inches down, it might not be as effective as an injection of telone deeper in the soil profile to control a bad nematode infestation. For those of you who are going to go with Pickchlor 60, I'd strongly encourage you to consider a TIF mulch, as it will greatly improve pest management. So much of our focus has obviously been on making a firm bed to keep the fumigant in the soil profile, choosing the right mulch to maximize the life of the fumigant in the soil profile. So when we increase that concentration in the soil over time, we're going to get better pest management. We're going to get a better bang for our buck, but we're also going to have a greater potential to damage the crop if we're not careful and understand the planting interval we need between application and fumigation. This is also greatly influenced by soil temperature and soil texture. The cooler the soil temperature, the slower the product's going to move. So it'll stay in the bed for a longer period of time. Soil texture will also obviously influence the ability of that fumigant to escape. So be very careful and very knowledgeable about your planting interval between fumigation and planting. Now, I haven't mentioned a lot about herbicides under the mulch. And in general, herbicides do not perform very well under mulch. So if you're using Metam, I don't believe herbicides are needed. This definitely increases your flexibility if you change the mind of what crop you want to plant. But if you are going to apply herbicides under mulch, here's an example of what you need to be thinking about. First, you have got to have a preformed bed that is ready to have plastic laid on top of it. Second, you'll notice we need to lay the drip tape prior to spraying. If you do not lay that drip tape ahead of time, basically you push the herbicide right over to where the plant hole is going to be, and you're going to stunt your crop. And then finally, you'll see the spraying is occurring just before the plastic. Basically, we broadcast that spray and we saran wrap that mulch right over top of it. Again, keep in mind, herbicides need a significant amount of water for activation. At times, it's quite difficult to activate the herbicides to their maximum level when applied under plastic mulch. Now, what about applying herbicides over plastic mulch? Let's say we're preparing for a second crop planting, or maybe we had some nutsedge escape our fumigation and we need to go out and make an application of Roundup. So have you ever thought about, if you have previous holes and you apply glyphosate, you get glyphosate in the old hole. Here's an example of an old hole. Here's an example of an old hole. Then when you irrigate to wash the plastic off, that rainfall washes more Roundup into that plant hole. Alright, this is an example of what would happen if you stick a plant in an old plant hole with the residual activity of Roundup being present on your right versus poking a new hole. So fascinating relationship. Start thinking about the herbicides you're using and thinking about the importance of understanding, did I land in an old hole? Am I poking a new hole? What kind of herbicide chemistry do I have? Does it wash off the plastic? What kind of potential damage do I have? Just to give you another example, same study where we land in an old plant hole. On your left is a non-treated. As you move across to the right, you can see the level of damage increase as the rate of Roundup Power Max increased. Again, we washed the plastic off. We just ended up with residual activity in the old plant hole. So that's something that we need to consider when we're making these management decisions. Now, if you're poking new holes, or you've shifted those plant holes and we're using products like Roundup, then we're fine. You just need to be aware that if you're planting a second crop squash or second crop cucumber, and that squash or cucumber lands in an old hole where you previously applied glyphosate, you may see some variability in your field. And again, we'll expand on this greatly next year in Savannah. Now, when we apply Roundup and many other herbicides over the top of mulch, they will wash off. Now, they may wash into the old plant hole, as we just discussed. But keep in mind, there are some herbicides that is not the case. And they're much more complicated to manage. Sandia is a perfect example. What I'm sharing with you is the percent of Sandia that remains on the mulch over time. Percent is along the y-axis, days are along the x-axis. Then you have two lines. The red line is where the mulch was not washed. You can see Sandia is very stable in the environment and it will sit on that plastic. The yellow line, interestingly, shows you where we irrigated a ½ inch each day. So a ½ inch on day 1, day 2, 3, 4, and 5. So by here, this is 2½ inches of rain have occurred, yet we still have Sandia on the mulch. So this is an example of a herbicide that you cannot effectively remove from the mulch. So what does that mean? That means if you were to go out and apply Sandia over top of the mulch and then come back with a sensitive crop, for example, broccoli or cabbage or collards, this is the type of response that we would have. On your left is where no Sandia was applied. On your right, we applied Sandia 1 or 2 weeks ahead of planting, and the potential damage there is significant. What if you go out to 3 and 4 weeks? By 3 weeks, we had over 11 inches of rain, yet we still had significant damage. So my point to you is if you're applying a herbicide over top of plastic, you need to understand the relationship of that herbicide with the plastic you're using, and also you need to understand the crop sensitivity to that herbicide that you're applying. My goal today is certainly not to tell you how to lay plastic, but I do hope that I've helped you think. Think about forming a better bed. Think about making a better fumigant application, selecting the right mulch, thinking through the herbicides you use and how you apply them. And it's been a great opportunity to be with you, and I can't wait to see you next year in person in Savannah.